Language is integral to culture. It is a way of communication, and it's just as diverse as language is as diverse as culture is, which we'll get to very momentarily. Depending on what language you talk to, there are between about 7,000, 8,000 languages worldwide today. At one time, there were many more, but we are losing a lot of those languages, which we will talk about a little bit more next week. There are about 11 languages that are spoken by over 100 million people today. 153 languages spoken by at least 3 million people, and then the remaining languages of the 8,000, roughly 8,000 that we have, are spoken by less than 3 million people. And that means we are losing a lot of that rich history and tradition of various cultures because we have a lot of languages that are dying out, and we'll explore that and how some cultures are trying to preserve their language next week. So there are some videos that are not in this lecture because of time, but they are on Schoology in the slide deck that third period got to watch. So please check those out. The first one is a video of a 4-year-old who speaks at least 7 languages, and it's pretty interesting. So language is a system of communications through speech. It's a group of sounds with a shared meaning that the group who speaks it understands. Many languages have a literary tradition, so a written form of communication that goes with that oral tradition, but there are many languages that only have an oral tradition. And the difficulty with the oral tradition is that we don't have a way to document how the language was distributed, like where it started, and then to show kind of how people migrated based on that written record. So that is the one difficulty with that oral tradition. The only thing we have to rely on is the history of the people who speak the language have said, and that's often hard to kind of validate. Many countries have or designate an official language for governmental purposes, mostly for documentation as far as passing laws, street signs, currency, things like that. Often in countries that are linguistically diverse, you might have more than one official language. For example, in Africa, where people might speak at least you might have at least 3 or 4 different languages that people speak within a country, or lots of people, where at least, you've got 4 languages that are spoken by many people. That kind of helps figure out which one will be the official communication. In Africa, usually you'll have at least 2 official languages. One would be a European language that's left over from colonization. Sometimes the schools or education is provided in that language because it's historically most people would speak that one, and then the second one would be the majority language that the largest ethnic group would speak in that country. The definitions, the 3 big ones you need to know are bolded here, which I'll go over, and the other 2 just kind of help to understand language a little better. Proto-tongue is a culture. Language, again, is a culture trait that's passed down from generation to generation. It's speculated that about 2.5 million years ago, there was one language that everyone spoke, and then as they migrated, obviously it's going to diverge because people come in contact with new environments, and they are not speaking with the same people, so the language is gonna change. And so divergence occurred, but linguists have been able to piece together through history what they think and research what that language thought it sounded like. So on the Schoology slide deck, there is a video that talks about what they think the first language sounded like, so check that out. So language divergence is when speakers of the same language scatter and they develop variations of the original form of language. So for example, English, you have the fact that British English, as the British migrated and established colonies worldwide, English is going to take on very different forms. For example, American English and Canadian English, very different in some respects from British English, definitely much more American English from the standpoint of there are different vocabulary words, the spelling is different. and that happened over time because you have different people migrate into the US. The Americans changed the spelling on purpose, which we'll talk about in a minute, and as they were here in North America, they encountered different animals and plants that they needed to develop different words for, and the accent changed as well. The pronunciation of words changed over time as, again, more people migrated in and things changed. Language convergence is when 2 more languages come together and they blend. That is also you can see that here in American English as you have different immigrant groups migrating in, different cultures come in, they're gonna pick up words from each other. So American English has many different words from different cultures that have come in. We've integrated words from Asian cultures and Latin American cultures into English, so our vocabulary is much more expansive than it was 150 years ago. So again, our American English has changed quite a bit as we've incorporated new words from other cultures over time. Language replacement is when a language group comes in and conquers another culture and completely wipes out their language and insists that they speak theirs. For example, when the Spanish came to the Americas, they they conquered the Aztecs and Incas. The Inca language is pretty much wiped out. We do have written records of it, but today nobody really speaks it. In the west coast of Latin America, or South America, I should say, Quechua, which is the language that the Incas spoke, is still spoken in areas of the Andes Mountains, so we still have that, and we do have a written record of it as well, but the Aztec language is pretty much wiped out. So that would be an example, and it was replaced with Spanish. Reverse reconstruction, we've been able to reconstruct the proto-tongue because linguistics have been able to go back and kind of piece together words throughout history to be able to figure out what the language was like. So that's how linguists have been able to kind of reconstruct ancient languages by thinking, okay, well, this group was here, they spoke this, and kind of do it backwards. All right. So how do we look at language from the big picture? These are kind of out of order on this slide deck, but so big picture, if you think about languages, you think about it as a tree. A language family is the trunk of the tree. That these languages, the collection of languages that can be related because they have a prehistoric origin. Folks spoke this language, they all have a common ancestor, and then they migrated out. The largest group is the Indo-European family, which is where English comes from. And they started in Central Asia, and then they migrated out. So Indo-European is kind of going to be your example for the most part. So then you've got the trunk of the tree, which is a family, and then you've got language branches, which branch out through migration. So a branch is a collection of languages that possess a common origin, but then split into different individual languages. So we're going to talk about branch next. So think about the branches of a tree. We're going to example here for the Romance branch. The Romance branch have in common that they all have their roots in ancient Rome. So they have Latin as their base. So from the branch, they branch off into groups. All right, so the group that we're going to talk about here are languages that have common past in the respect that they share similar vocabulary and grammar and things like that. So here we talk about like Spanish and French because they have their roots in Latin, so they would branch off into their own languages. So the groups would form their own languages from that aspect of it. So just to review, you've got the trunk or the family, which would be the trunk of the tree. So you have Indo-European. Then the branch are going to be languages that have a common origin. So the Romance languages all have their roots in the fact that they were based in a common ancestor here, areas that were settled by the Romans, hence the name Romance. Then those branches are going to split even further, subdivide as you have the little branches on a tree. Here we're going to be talking about the like, for example, Spanish and French, because they have similar vocabulary and voc grammar, so that's the group. And then within a group, you're gonna have further subdividing because each of those languages would have dialects of their own. So within, say, French, you're depending on where you are in France, the language might vary a bit with pronunciation and grammar vocabulary, so it might be spoken a little bit differently in the northern part of France than the southern part of France. So just to review a little bit again, family is the biggest part of the hierarchy. That's the trunk of the tree. Then you're going to branch off into smaller groups that have a common ancestor. Here, the Romance branch were areas that were all settled by Rome, and then those branches are going to subdivide a little further into groups. So these areas have common ancestor, obviously with Latin, and so Spanish and French would be one group, and they have a common vocabulary and spelling. And then the groups are going to subdivide further into dialects, so each individual language will have variations within it. For example, in France, you're going to have variations of the language. In the country, variations with spelling and pronunciation and grammar. All right, so we're going to talk about how English came to be. So the English itself is a compilation of about 4 different languages that are layered together to form what we know of English today. So initially, the British Isles were settled by the Celts. Then they are invaded by the Germanic tribes, which bring an older form of German to the British Isles, and they're the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Anglo-Saxons, so much of modern English is derived from the language that the Anglo-Saxons spoke. So we're basically going to say the Germanic tribes. And at that time, all of the Germans spoke the same language. About the 800s, the Vikings are going to come in. They spoke Norse. So far, we've got the language the Germanic tribe spoke. So Germans. Then we have Norse. So Germans and Norse are both 2 languages that are going to influence English. Then in 1066, we're going to have the invasion of the Normans who spoke French. They're going to come in and invade England. They're going to rule England for about 300 years. And here you have a bit of a switch where the upper classes are going to speak French. The lower classes are going to speak that mix of German and Norse together. So the lower classes are going to speak. So English is a mixed match of German and Norse at the time, and the upper classes are going to speak French. When the French leave after 300 years, English will reign again. But at this point, it's a hybrid of English and French together. So the languages that impacted English are going to be the German that the Anglo-Saxons spoke, the Norse, the Vikings brought over, and then French. So those are the 3 languages that form the basis of modern-day English. English is widely spoken worldwide today. It's the first language for over about 330 million people. It's spoken fluently by about 500 million people. It's an official language in lots of countries. It's predominantly in the US and Australia, mostly due to settlement by the British. And about a third, about 2 billion people in the world, it's their official language. So how did it get there? How did English become such widely spread? Mostly through colonization and migration. In the early 1700s, Britain colonized North and Canada and North America, Australia. Then in the late 1800s, the colonization in Africa, parts of Asia, also through migration as well to various parts of the world. And also through English-speaking areas of the world being dominant in commerce as well is also gonna fuel that. So and through the spread of Westernization culture, again, with the economic piece being behind it, particularly in the post-World War II era, that has pretty much been fueling the spread and dominance of English as one of the major languages that's spoken worldwide for at least since the early 20th century. So this is a map of showing where English is spoken. The orange countries are where it's officially or mostly widely used, and then the yellow is not official, but it's widely used as well. And again, a dialect we mentioned before is a regional variation of a language, and it's distinguished by vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. And it really reflects the variations of geographical features of where people live. And you can see that separation of that variation, it's called an isogloss. One of the biggest variations you could see, for example, would be in, say, like the US, if you're going from like the north to the south, like the northeast to the south, you can see variations in pronunciation of words. And here in the US would be an example of that. And you can kind of just, you can survey people and see the variations of how the vocabulary that they use, and for different words and grammar as well. And that's happened mostly as people migrated from different parts of the country. You also saw that in Great Britain as well as people immigrated in, as people came into the country, and then the history of different groups moving in and how that changed over time. So there are three different groups that came into Britain originally: the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The origins of the different dialects before the French invasion was Old English. That's obviously based on the Anglos and the Saxons where they lived. After the French invasion, you have 5 different dialects that emerged. But in the 1500s, you have the standardized language that developed, which mostly was spoken by the upper classes. And they basically standardized the speech for writing and for speaking. And then with the printing press, that got standardized throughout the country. And so the grammar books and things were published in London, and that is still kind of what disseminated throughout the country. And then you start to have 3 major dialects come through there: Northern, Midland, and Southern after that. So another thing that you have is differences between British and American English. And again, as I mentioned before, when the majority of the colonists that first came to the American colonies were from England. And the there are major things that happened that changed, that caused the differences between American English and British English. First, there was isolation from Great Britain because between the 17 and 1800s, they developed very differently. The vocabulary developed because they encountered new animals and plants and new physical features. Just as a difference, didn't happen in the 1700s, but in the US, we call the mechanism that lifts you from floor to floor in a high-rise building an elevator. In Britain, they call it a lift. The spelling is going to change because certain Americans wanted to develop a different identity. Noah Webster, who was one of the publishers of the first American dictionaries, wanted American English to be a different dialect uniquely. So he changed the spelling to be a national language. For example, in Britain, you have OUR as a combination. He changed that, dropped the U, so it's OR. And there's some other combinations we'll see in a minute. And pronunciation starts to change because as you have different groups come into the US, it changes the pronunciation of words, and they also bring in more words as well. So that changes. So a lot of English would say we don't speak proper English, that it obviously it changes. So the 3 biggest variations are gonna be vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. So some of the words here, these are just some of the examples of the British say O-U-R, we go O-R, T-R-E, we go T-E-R, and so forth, and these are just variations of different words that we use, particularly with clothing. So there are a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities as well. We have different dialects here in the United States, and this all goes back to the original settlement patterns. People in New England mostly came from Southeast England. In the southeastern part of the US, again, half of them are from Southeast England, but they were also socially, they were from different economic classes, so that's also gonna vary their pronunciation of words because the upper classes spoke one dialect using that standard English. The lower classes, their dialects were a little bit different. And the Mid-Atlantic, which is where we live, is where the most diverse. That's where you had the largest immigrant population from northern part of England, Scots and the Irish, the Germans and the Swedes, and then over time, obviously, more immigrant groups are gonna come in and they're gonna spread out, and that's where you have, the variation of dialects. But today, what you will see is the 2 dialects that are closest to English dialects you will find in the Northeast, so like in New England, and then part of the Southeast of the US. So 3 questions just to be familiarize yourselves with that you will see on a quiz a little bit later on language would be what languages influenced English? What are some differences between American and British English? And why did these differences occur? So next, if you could go to Google Classroom or Schoology and complete the slide deck on branches and distribution, that would be on Indo-European branch, that would be great.